In the last session, we looked at a wide spectrum of theories on addiction, ranging from deterministic theories about how drugs affect the brain through to theories which revolve more around free will and choice. So in this session, we're going to look in more depth at social and psychological aspects of addiction. We're going to begin with some famous studies and consider how they might relate to addiction. The first study relates to some work done by Walter Mischel on self-control. And these were pioneering studies about the ability to delay gratification and exert self-control. His studies are sometimes referred to as the marshmallow experiment and looked at young children and their ability to forgo gratification and wait instead for a larger desired but delayed response. This was a study conducted in 1972 at Stanford University. So in one variation of the study, a marshmallow was offered to each child. If the child could resist eating the marshmallow, he or she was promised 2 instead of 1. The study then analysed how long each child resisted the temptation of eating the marshmallow and whether or not doing so had an effect on their future success in life. This is considered one of the key experiments in the history of psychology. Continuing research with these original participants examined how their ability to delay gratification linked to development over their life course and may predict a series of outcomes, including people's use of drugs. So is this idea that certain people are vulnerable borne out? Do people differ in their ability to delay gratification? And how does this relate to people struggling with drugs or alcohol?
Let's look at a study by Mischel and colleagues in 2010, which looks at the role of impulsivity in relation to smoking. So this study was called Regulation of Craving by Cognitive Strategies in Cigarette Smokers. So 20 heavy cigarette smokers and 22 light smokers and 20 non-smokers completed the study, during which they were presented with photos of cigarettes and foods that had previously shown to induce craving. During each trial, participants were instructed to think of the stimulus in one of two ways: by focusing either on the short-term consequences associated with consuming the item or with the long-term consequences. So what they found was that for cigarette smoking participants, cigarette craving was significantly reduced when focusing on the long-term consequences associated with smoking. So what they suggest is that future studies using this model could test the efficacy of different cognitive strategies and develop targeted intervention based on the regulation of these findings. So it seems to me that one implication of these findings is that impulsivity is not so fixed as might be thought. It can be altered by using certain cognitive strategies. Finally, it's worthwhile noting that they link these findings to brain mechanisms. They go on to say in the paper that the findings could be used to investigate the neural mechanisms that underlie the regulation of craving to determine whether smokers successfully recruit neural systems required for the regulation of craving. And what they'd say is that this is important because it relates to recent work showing the role of prefrontal circuits associated with this regulation. So whether that's an important finding, the key thing is, I think, is showing that impulsivity may not be as fixed as some other people have suggested. This is an experiment by the American psychologist Harry Harlow from a 1958 paper called The Nature of Love. And in this classic experiment, two groups of baby monkeys were removed from their mothers. In the first group, a terry cloth mother provided no food, while a wire mother did in the form of an attached bottle containing milk. In the second group, a terry cloth mother provided food. The wire mother did not. So you can see the experimental setup here with the wire mother and the terry cloth mother. In both conditions, the infant monkey received all its milk from the mother surrogate here. Thus, the experiment was designed as a test of the relative importance of the variables of contact comfort and nursing comfort. As we will see, the data make it obvious that contact comfort is a variable of overwhelming importance in the development of affectional response, whereas lactation is a variable of negligible importance. This is a finding completely contrary to the interpretation of derived drive, in which the mother form becomes conditioned to a hunger reduction. And here we can see some of the key data from the experiment. First of all, we have the graph showing what happens when the monkeys are fed on the cloth mother. And we can see here the amount of time spent per day with the cloth mother. And you can see that when they're fed by the cloth mother, they spend most of the time on the cloth mother and very little time on the wire mother. When they're fed with the wire mother, we can see strikingly similar results. They still spend most of the time with the cloth mother. So what Harlow showed that mother love was emotional rather than physiological. Second, here's an experiment that relates to Harlow's work, and it's called The Effects of Morphine and Naloxone on Separation Distress and Approach Attachment, Evidence for Opiate Mediation of Social Effect. So in this experiment, the researchers looked at morphine, which is an opiate agonist, and naloxone, which is an opiate antagonist, on various indices of attachment in guinea pigs. And what they found was that in infants, crying or separation-induced distress were significantly decreased by low-dose morphine, whereas naloxone increased separation distress. So what this experiment seems to show is that being separated is a cause of stress, as Harlow showed, and the opiates may be capable of reducing this distress. We're going to look at Abraham Maslow now. Maslow's supervisor was actually Harry Harlow that we just talked about, but the psychology that he developed was very different. Most psychologists before Maslow were concerned with abnormal behavior, but he wanted to know what constituted positive mental health. And he developed humanistic psychology, which has given rise to several therapies, all guided by the idea that people possess inner resources and that the point of therapy is to help remove obstacles to individuals achieving their aims. Some of the basic principles of humanistic psychology are that people's present functioning is the most significant thing about their lives. As a result, humanists tend to emphasize the here and now
instead of examining the past. To be mentally healthy, individuals must take personal responsibility for their actions. And Maslow developed this hierarchy of needs, which we can see here, based on many interviews with people. And we can see that the hierarchy goes from physiological needs at the bottom through safety needs, all the way up through self-actualization and transcendence. So Maslow initially thought that the highest aim that you could achieve was self-actualization, in which you're fulfilling your own potential. Transcendence, which comes later, is a situation where you put your own needs aside to serve something greater than yourself. And this approach has been used quite a lot to understand addictive behavior. So Maslow's hierarchy, which we saw in the last slide, has been used to describe addiction in two ways. On the one hand, it can describe the different types of alcoholic based on what level they're dealing with in the hierarchy. It can also be used to describe to people when they become involved in substance abuse. So there can be different reasons for why people turn to alcohol or drugs depending on their location in the hierarchy. One of the most common reasons for why people use alcohol or drugs is that it gives their self-esteem a boost. Unfortunately, this effect is only temporary because addiction means that the individual will lose the respect of people, and eventually they may lose their own self-worth. But people may well have different views on what their addictive behavior is achieving. Individuals may think that the substances they used are necessary for their survival. An example of this would be the person who's afraid to stop because they're worried about withdrawal symptoms. The person may turn to substance abuse because they believe it benefits their security needs. When they're drunk, they can get a false sense of security. Thus, substances can deceive the individual into believing that their social needs are being catered for. When drugs and alcohol come first in your life, the rest of your needs can begin to fall away, and you can neglect your basic needs such as food and relationships. For example, somebody will allow themselves to become homeless to ensure that they continue their drug and alcohol use. Maslow's hierarchy has been around since 1943, and it may be a helpful model to explain exactly what addiction does to our motivation towards our needs. Another important figure is Albert Bandura. Bandura's work was concerned with self-efficacy, which he defined as beliefs in one's capabilities to organize and execute the courses of actions required to produce given attainments. And self-efficacy has become an important part of theories of relapse to substance misuse. So Bandura thought that self-efficacy can have an impact on everything from psychological states to behavior and motivation. And there are different ways in which we can achieve self-efficacy. One is by mastering experiences ourselves, performing a task and it being successful. However, failing to achieve the task can weaken self-efficacy. Another way is social modeling, when we witness other people achieving tasks. According to Bandura, seeing people similar to oneself succeed raises observers' belief that they too possess these capabilities. Another thing is social persuasion. Bandura asserted that people could be persuaded to believe that they have the skills and capabilities to succeed. Consider a time when somebody said something positive and encouraged you. And finally, our own psychological responses. Our own responses and emotional reactions to situations also play an important role in self-efficacy. A person who becomes nervous before speaking in public may develop a weak sense of self-efficacy. We'll look at some studies that build on Bandura's work. So Bandura developed a wider theory, which has come to be known as social learning theory. We've looked at, talked about self-efficacy. The other important aspect is outcome expectancies. So self-efficacy, as we've seen, relates to a person's belief that they can maintain control over the facts that influence their lives. It refers to the valuation made by individuals in relation to their capability of performing an act. Outcome expectancies refers to a person's belief as to whether their involvement will result in the desired outcome or not. So these are the two key concepts, and they have been studied in relation to addiction. So one study, for example, found that higher self-efficacy at intake to treatment was associated with better clinical outcome. Another study found that outcome expectancies, defined as the costs and benefits expected to results in people's drinking behavior, did not predict consumption at follow-up. However, self-efficacy assessed at intake of treatment was strongly associated with level of consumption. So I think this is still an ongoing field with different studies coming up with different findings specifically to self-efficacy and outcomes, but it's clear that they're both important factors in relation to addiction. And it may be that other theories, for example, conditioning theories, which we'll look at later, can't really make sense of drug behavior because they're not looking at the psychological and environmental aspects, which is what Bandura was looking at. I mentioned an important feature of Bandura's work concerned the study of modeling behavior. And in a famous experiment where children did or didn't observe another child being aggressive to a toy, what Bandura found was that children who observed the aggressive model were more likely to make imitative aggressive responses than those who were in non-aggressive or control groups. There were also more non-imitative aggression among the children who have observed aggressive behavior, where the children invented their own aggressive actions or phrases. So social learning theories would suggest that people can fall into addiction due to modeling. If an individual grows up in an environment where others appear to be rewarded for addictive behavior such as drinking, there could be a strong motivation to copy this behavior. Alcohol is often promoted as something positive, and it is strongly associated with relaxing and having a good time. The idea that people may copy this behavior due to modeling makes sense, but the behavior that a person models can ultimately be negative. Those caught up in addiction can be helped by spending more times around others who have already broken free of this behavior. By modeling good models, the person can learn how to handle their new behavior, and the individual also gets to see the benefit of this different approach to life. So modeling can be an effective way to increase self-efficacy because the person could reach the conclusion based on the behavior of other people that if other people can behave like that, then they can also do it themselves. So where does this lead us, these psychological theories? Let's look at a paper from 1979, which has been quite influential, entitled Heroin Maintenance, a Medical View. And the paper says, if a monkey is provided with a lever which he can press to self-inject heroin, he establishes a regular pattern of heroin use that takes priority over the normal activities of his life. And Goldstein goes on to say, I have to infer that if heroin were easily available, and if there were no social pressures of any kind to discourage heroin use, a very large number of people would become heroin addicts. So if this is the prevailing view, and I think it is to a large extent, it would suggest that psychological processes are not really an important part of addiction because it's just the power of the drug in terms of its effects on the brain that causes addiction, and psychological factors don't really play a role in this process. So Goldstein makes this view clear. He says a rat addiction to heroin is not rebelling against society, is not a victim of socioeconomic circumstances, and is not a product of a dysfunctional family. The rat's behavior is simply controlled by the action of heroin on its brain. So the media seem to by and large accept this view that drugs are irresistibly addicting to rodents and by extension to human beings. And so this has really led to the current situation where most research is directed towards looking at brain mechanisms involved in addiction and a medical model involving treatment of addiction, rather than looking at any psychological processes or sociological processes that might be involved in addiction. We saw in the previous slide the typical laboratory setup for studying addictive behavior, in which a rat is by itself in a cage and only has access to one thing, which is the heroin. Around about the same time that Goldstein was reporting his findings, another paper also looked at this phenomena, but in a different context. This paper was called "The Effect of Housing and Gender on Morphine Self-Administration in Rats," conducted by Bruce Alexander and his colleagues in Canada. Alexander had noticed that laboratory rats are gregarious and curious creatures, so instead of isolated rats, Alexander decided to use rats in a more natural surroundings. What would these rats do in terms of their morphine consumption? So what he did was he built a more natural environment, which you can see illustrated here. So we have the rats have more space. They have a picture of a landscape around them. And there was also more than one rat in the cage. So in the rat's cages, the rat's appetite for morphine was measured by fastening two drinking bottles that we can see here, one containing morphine and one containing water, and various experiments were conducted to look at their morphine and water consumption. We'll talk about one experiment that Alexander conducted. It's called the seduction. So in the seduction, researchers put 16 lab rats into Rat Park and 16 into standard cages. Because plain morphine is bitter and rats have a sweet tooth, the researchers gave both sets of rat morphine-laced water with sucrose added just a little at first, increasing each day. Both rats also had plain tap water to choose from. And the results are shown here. The caged rats took the morphine instantly, even with virtually no sweetener. But no matter how sweet the morphine became, the rats in Rat Park resisted it. They would try it occasionally, but invariably they showed a preference for the plain water. And by the end of the experiment, the caged rats had consumed 16 times more morphine than the Rat Park rats. So Alexander conducted various experiments. Here are two examples. In one experiment, only morphine-laced solution was available for 57 days, in other words, to try to make the rats addicted. And then he allowed them to choose tap water. For the most part, they chose the tap water. In a second experiment, naloxone was added to the morphine-laced liquid. Naloxone is a substance that negates the effects of opioids, but it spared the sweet taste of the water. The Rat Park rats, it seemed, wanted the sweet water so long as it did not disrupt their normal social behavior. In 2001, Alexander wrote a paper called "The Myth of Drug-Induced Addiction," in which he wrote, "Nothing that we tried instilled a strong appetite for morphine or produced anything that looked like addiction in rats that were housed in a reasonably normal environment." He goes on to say, "The results of conventional experiments do not show that rats became addicted, but that severely distressed animals, like severely distressed people, will relieve their distress pharmacologically if they can. He later expanded this thesis in a book called The Globalization of Addiction, a study in poverty of the spirit, in which he argues that cultural dislocation of human beings instigates addictions of all sorts, including addictions that do not involve drugs, just as isolation instigates drug consumption in laboratory animals. So here we can see a diametrically opposed view that it's not drugs that induce addiction, but it's being psychologically or socially distressed. So two very different hypotheses regarding the nature of addiction. Now we're going to look at another different psychological approach, which is sometimes called the psychodynamic or the psychoanalytic way of understanding addiction. And it does have some common themes with Alexander's work. According to the psychoanalytic view, addiction is basically a disorder of self-regulation. For example, individuals with histories of exposure to adverse effects tend to have diminished capacity to regulate negative emotions and cope effectively with stress. So in some ways that's also similar to Bandura's view about self-efficacy. These individuals may be self-medicating their anxiety and mood disorders. It's also instructive to know that many individuals experiment with drugs, but few become addicted. The psychodynamic approach to addiction looks at how past events, thoughts, and circumstances help to shape a patient's present behavior. In the psychoanalytic view, it is thought that these factors result in unconscious processes that cause a person to act in a particular manner. So, in the psychoanalytic view, addiction is described as a defensive strategy to avoid feelings of helplessness or powerlessness. The addict tries to compensate via addictive behavior for painful subjective states of low self-esteem and anxiety. The addict substitutes an imaginary world where he is in control, where he feels, where in the real world where he feels useless and out of control. Repeated use of drugs to gain relief become a way of life. Relief is momentary, but in the long term, drug use becomes an end in itself. So this is a more complex theory of explaining how drugs become addictive by way of unconscious psychological processes, which we will look at. In a 2002 book called The Psychodynamics of Addiction, edited by Wiegman and Cohen, the authors make an important point, which is that simply identifying triggers for relapse and related cognitive behavioral treatments alone are not sufficient to prevent use and reversion to addictive behaviors. This is a very important point because cognitive behavioral therapies are very popular in the treatment of addiction. They say that it's only through appreciating the deeper psychodynamic layers that we've talked about that we can appreciate why addictive drugs are so compelling. So again, here we have two different points of view, one focusing on cognitive processes and one focusing on more psychodynamic processes. The key figure in psychoanalysis is Sigmund Freud. In 1920, he published this essay called Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And what he had noticed was that when he was treating soldiers returning from the First World War with shell shock, that they would often have dreams in which they were repeating the situation in which they'd suffered their trauma. And this was a puzzle to him because up until then, he'd interpreted dreams as being to do with pleasure, hence the pleasure principle. So in later life, Freud saw that repetition was an attempt to master painful experiences. So when we have trauma, we try to go back, as it were, to see whether we could master those stressful experiences. And in daily life, but especially in times of stress, we tend to flee back to the time when we were most happy. So you could see that in this framework why something like addictive behaviors could become important, because they're a way of overcoming stress in life. Of course, other people had observed that unconscious processes are important, but Freud was really the first to study the unconscious systematically. He noted that we live two mental lives, one when we're awake, it is ordered, rational and linear and bounded by rules, but when we're asleep it's more chaotic and non-linear, and we can see this in our dreams. So there are three key areas that are important for psychoanalysis. One is that the past is important. Current problems stem from unresolved issues. Second, there are a variety of defense mechanisms for dealing with problems in daily life, which we'll look at. And that psychological symptoms are brought about by a conflict between different parts of the mind. These are not physical divisions within their mind, but Freud conceptualized that there's divisions between the unconscious as represented by the id, the ego represented by the conscious mind, and the influence of society represented by the superego. And everyone's in a constant conflict between these three agencies. The one study in this field, in the field of substance misuse treatment, demonstrates that alcoholics who dream about drinking during the course of their treatment tend to achieve longer periods of sobriety. This finding suggests that clients who dream about substances they are tending to abstain from may be more engaged in the treatment process. In other words, these clients take their struggle more seriously. So that's one example of a dream-related study. There are a few other interesting examples in the literature. So this is an area that perhaps not many people look at, but it's possibly quite an interesting area in understanding how addiction forms. There have not been many studies of the effect of psychoanalysis for treating addiction, but one study published in 2012 claims that it is an effective treatment both in terms of abstinence and other psychological outcomes. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of a possible psychoanalytic treatment? It could be that it helps the person to tell his or her story. It could be that it is effective in dealing with problems of resistance, in other words, things that are hidden from consciousness. It may be effective in exploring the precipitating events. But one reason why psychoanalysis is not very popular at the moment is that therapy is a long process that can take many years. I mentioned earlier defense mechanisms as one of the key concepts of psychoanalysis, and both Freud and his daughter Anna Freud, who is also a psychoanalyst, outlined some of these defense mechanisms. And here's a list of some of them. It's not a complete list, but so these things of which we're not conscious of doing, but they help us to function in everyday life. So for example, repression. This is where we push things into the unconscious, for example, trauma from your childhood. Sublimation is where we act out unacceptable impulses in a socially acceptable way, for example, lifting weights to release pent-up energy. Denial would be arguing against an anxiety-provoking stimuli by stating that it doesn't exist, for example, denying doctor's diagnosis of illness and seeking a second opinion. Displacement would be, the description would be taking out impulses on a less threatening target, for example, slamming a door instead of hitting a person. And there are many others. And you can probably see as you go through these lists that you're familiar with all these things. So even if one doesn't accept psychoanalytic theory, it seems possible or probable that these are mechanisms that we use in everyday life which show that unconscious factors are important in shaping our behavior. One interesting example, which Freud also mentioned, was parapraxis, which are slips of the tongue. And I remember being at a conference a few years ago where a prominent researcher was talking about her research into interviewing drug users, and she said, I interviewed 5 losers, and then she quickly corrected herself. I meant 5 users, and most people didn't even notice a slip of the tongue. Now, it could be this is a good example of where another type of psychologist would just say, well, the words are semantically very similar. It's just a slip of the tongue, and it doesn't have any psychological meaning. So that's one of the key aspects of psychoanalysis is interpreting things of psychological meaning, which they may or may not have in real life. Psychoanalysis is a wide-ranging theory developed over many years. Freud wrote about many topics, including love, aggression, childhood, family relations, civilization, dreams, conflicting emotions that make up our everyday lives. He didn't write specifically very much about addiction, although as we've seen, other people have. However, the key point for all psychoanalytic approaches is rooted in Freud's observations that many problems that people have are psychological in origin, not physical. But we have to mention that not everybody agrees with Sigmund Freud's approach. There are many criticisms of Freudian theory, but it's important to say that Freud did consider his approach to be scientific, even although he didn't do experiments. For example, Darwin didn't do experiments in developing his theory of evolution. So the criticisms are that by modern standards, Freud did not have scientific data to support his theories. The concepts in Freud theory that we've talked about, such as the id and the ego, cannot be observed. It's not a theory which, generally speaking, can predict events. It only explains behavior after the fact. And again, that would be considered something important for a modern theory to be able to make predictions. Another criticism is that the observations that Freud were on a very small sample and were not representative of the population. So these are just some of the criticisms. Essentially, what they argue is that it's an untestable theory, which is not provable and therefore has little scientific work. But as we've just observed, some of the concepts may be important in understanding addictive behavior. Finally, let's just have a quick look at a book called The Grass Arena by John Healy. This is an autobiography of somebody who really was at the most severe end of the addiction spectrum and ended up in prison. And in prison, he learned how to play chess, and his whole life changed in an instant. And he began to study chess seriously, and later when he left prison became one of Britain's strongest chess players, which is something very unusual for somebody in later life to be able to learn and play chess to such a high level. But why it's important is because of the psychoanalytic concepts, which, although not explicitly mentioned in the book, do come across. What we see is alcohol as a defense mechanism to pain and trauma that he had in childhood and also later on as an adult. And in an interesting preface to the book by Colin McCabe, he says that psychoanalysts have emphasized the alcoholic's search for a harmonious relationship to the world. And he also goes on to say psychoanalysis should be an area in which one could find the concepts to deal with addiction. The Grass Arena would suggest that the relation to alcohol can only be understood within a wider social panorama. So that's the themes that we've looked at in this presentation are the ways in which psychological processes may or may not play a role in addiction, and we've looked at some of the key theories which outline some of the factors which may explain addiction.